So we talked about China and how it was formed as in civilizations and societies. The other two sort of major components of East Asia are Japan and Korea. Here's a nice picture of sort of them both to give you an idea of the sort of geography of Japan. Obviously, I think people are aware of an island off the coast of Asia. Here's and Korea is a peninsula, so they're very relatively close, as we will see. There's a lot of connections between Korea and Japan as well. Here you can kind of see sort of Japan's topography. It definitely had maritime connections with Asia, but it's also cut off, so it's sort of isolated, allowed it to develop its own sort of history, society, culture, language as well. Japan is unique too. It's very mountainous. You can kind of see here. That's why I like this sort of topography. It's a little lighter spots. These are sort of flatter lands where rivers are coming out of the mountains. This would be Tokyo here, Nagoya, Osaka. But there's within Japan there's very limited places to live, really. I mean, unless you want to live up in the mountains. Here's Mount Fuji right here, and then pretty close to Tokyo. So people, when they did settle in Japan, they tended to settle along the coasts and these sort of flat plains near rivers. So this kind of gives you an idea of just sort of the geography overview of Japan. Today, there's a lot of cities, major cities. You can see how they're already located where these sort of flatter plains were. 5 main islands: Hokkaido, Kyushu, Honshu, Kyushu are the main one. Shikoku here, and then Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands down here. They did start getting rice here a little bit later. Rice was introduced to Japan, but also maritime resources as well. Kind of limited in their natural resources. There's not a lot that Japan, has. I mean, there's some minerals and things, but so Japan was somewhat dependent on trade, connecting with the outside worlds. And it is, as we know, if people are familiar, Japan does have a pretty. It was built during upheavals of tectonic plates. So there's a lot of earthquakes here, tsunamis, typhoons. So Japan and the people that have moved there and lived there over time have sort of faced a lot of environmental challenges there. And how did people get to Japan? They came over land. During sort of the Paleolithic period, when the Ice Age was in its full iciness. You can see that the ground here was all, you can see where the land masses existed. So Japan used to be connected to China, Korea, and all the way up to northern Russia. So people migrated in the Paleolithic period about 30,000 up to 10,000 years ago to Japan, migrated around, walked there. And that's kind of what's referred to this Jomon period, about 14,500 BCE, is that as these waves of people moved in, as again the Ice Age kind of ended and the seas rose up, these land masses were cut off from each other. So whenever people had come into Japan from places like China, Korea, and North, were then on this island, right? And they sort of said in what came out of this sort of Neolithic phase of Japanese history is this Jomon period. And here's sort of smaller settlements that existed all over Japan. And you can kind of, Jomon, it kind of goes, it's a very long period, 1450 to 300 BCE. There was some local production. One of the points of this is that a lot of people came to Japan before before people really understood domestication of plants and animals. So there wasn't really a lot of plants and animals being domesticated in Japan during the Jomon period. So it's more sort of settlements, small settlements, hunting and gathering. Maritime resources are very important there. We do have pottery and clay figures. So there's 3 main phases of the Jomon period. Incipient, sort of about 7,000 years, again, sort of Paleolithic, settling around these river plains of Japan. And then the initial one where you get sort of settlements, shifts to some small scale agriculture are there, and then increase of marine resources. Here's an early Jomon site. I did give a video of like what they think was like sort of Jomon society as well. And then kind of the essence of the height of Jomon period was this late Jomon, so the last 4,000 years, which would be more Neolithic. And what it's sort of typified of, and what the entire Jomon gets its name for, are this pottery that was formed there. And Jomon actually means sort of cord production, or made of cords or ropes. So this very interesting pottery that was created in Japan during the Jomon. So they make this out of clay and then fire it. And then some of these, I think those more, the ones that are preserved are definitely the more ceremonial ones that we can imagine. They made all sorts of types of pottery there. But this is really sort of, all this sort of type of pottery is very typical of this period of Japanese history. And this is where you get more permanent settlements starting to be established with those big houses we showed before. And by this time, by the end of the Jomon period, almost all of Japan was settled with peoples in it. And then we'll get into the next phases of Japan as it transitions to more state societies and imperial families. We'll get into that a little bit later. But this is where it all comes from. Here's another sort of Jomon period art, sort of some figure from the Jomon time, so you can see that the art and architecture we have of them is we know they had settlements from sort of archaeology of early Jomon sites, and the pottery was that. They didn't, as far as we know, they didn't have any written language. So I mean, they definitely had oral language, which probably a lot of those traditions are caught up in Shintoism, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But we don't have any written records of the Jomon period. Another group that was there that is important to the early history of Japan is the Ainu people. So they most likely maybe came from the north up through Hokkaido and then down. And they are distinct from the Jomon. They have their own language, so their Ainu language is not related to Japanese. So again, it suggests that they were a different wave of people. They actually have their own sort of architectural styles, their own fashion, their own language, music, customs. So within this early settlements of Japan, you have these Jomon peoples and this other group of the Ainu peoples. So, and there's mixing in between them as well. And the Ainu today, sometimes these are like the indigenous peoples of Japan. They're mainly found in the north, particularly up at Hokkaido. So but the Ainu people's presence there shows the different waves of migration into Japan. So that's early Japan. Their neighbors here is Korea. Here's the peninsulas, or North and South Korea. And I kept that there because there is definitely a distinction between geographic distinction and settlement state distinction between the North and the South. That up here, the North is a little flatter. It's connected a little bit more into what is now Manchuria and northern China. And then there's a mountain sort of range in the middle, and then the South is much more mountainous, a little harder topography, and different kingdoms did emerge in the North and the South throughout Korean history. And there were certain times where certain kingdoms were able to unify the entire peninsula. But the reason this North and South is here, historically there wasn't a distinction, and it wasn't two obviously different nations, but there are sort of distinctions between the North and the South as well. The northern is mountainous, southern has plains and agriculture there. So, and then Manchuria is up here. There's nomadic groups that could always come in. A lot of people did and settled there in part of North Korea. There's a lot of influence between China and Korea as well. And then also there's a lot of connection between Korea and Japan. Here's just some pictures of Korea, sort of the mountainous regions, some of the more flatland areas where geography could come. And then down here along the coastline, a lot of marine resources too in Korea as well. We have plenty of evidence of Neolithic sites all throughout Korea, so people have been there from at least 5,000 BC onwards. Rice was introduced to Korea, so they did start growing that. Korea has its own form of pottery. Here you can see that, so they created their pottery as well. They had bronze objects. Here's a early Neolithic Korean site. And then what's really interesting in Korea, they had these early sort of dolmen rock structures in burial mounds, and these are found all throughout Korea, sort of from this Neolithic phase of that. And then early Korea, the first sort of kingdom of Korea shows up in about 1200 BCE, called the Joseon Kingdom. Here's the first Emperor Dangun here. Interestingly, sort of the history of this, here you see sort of this group controlled northern Korea. There were some other, down later on, these other kingdoms, the Jin and the Ye, showed up in sort of the southern tip. You can kind of see the distinction between north and south there. But the first sort of state system was in the north. And it's believed that one of the stories is that this first emperor is actually a Shang king. So when the Shang rulers were overthrown, this Shang king Gija actually came and resettled in northern Korea. So and the idea was, I mean, whether this is historically accurate or not, but what it is it kind of talks about that that the connection there between China and Korea, that a lot of forms of statecraft, this sort of Shang period statecraft and traditions, were brought in during the sort of the Shang decline. So yeah, so sorry, the first mythical ruler, similar to the mythical rulers of China, was Dong Yun, 233 BC. And then there's another story of later on, this sort of establishing the Go-Joseon kingdom of the Shang king that comes there and creates the first site there. And during the Go-Joseon kingdom, you have increased urbanization. So a capital near what is now the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang. You have iron, early form pottery. They did have their own language. This is their oracle bones. So they had their own language, which is somewhat similar to Chinese, but it is definitely Korean as well. Later on, they developed their own writing system. Sometimes borrowed from Chinese, but it's been adapted as well. So iron, so material culture of this world. So Korea sets up a kingdom, but you can kind of see in the histories of the Korean kingdom, there's definitely a lot of contact between China and Korea. More so than in early phases of Japanese history, which just had the Jomon period, which were cut off geographically from the Chinese, Korean, other parts of East Asia by oceans. So that's the early formation of Japan and Korea.